Speaker, Kris Kobach, Attorney General for the state of Kansas. Welcome, Kris. And before we get started, if everybody will silence their phones. And then we'll say, everybody stand and say the flag salute. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. And if Pastor Farber will lead us in prayer.
Sure, let's pray. God, I love you tonight, and I thank you for a beautiful day that you've given to us. Thank you for your safety, for all of these who have made the trip to attend here tonight. I pray for your wisdom. I pray for your judgment as we hear and ask questions tonight, hear answers. And Lord, I pray that everything that happens here will be honoring in your sight as we continue to move forward for you as a country. Thank you for blessing our country. Thank you for protecting our servicemen and women all around the world tonight. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen. And before Kris gets started, I have a few announcements to make. When you came in, you got a card and a pen, and that is to write your questions on when we have a question answering for Kris, and we will do that after he gets done speaking. And when he's done, then you can start. We'll send a basket around and gather up your cards, and our moderator, Chad, will read the questions off, and then we will also pass a basket around for contributions to help pay for the room and our recorder and our security guards. So we'll pass a collection basket around for that. And our next Granny Brigade meeting will be May the 19th, and it will be here at the Knights of Columbus Hall, and we will have our 9 governor candidates here, Republican candidates. And then after the meeting, if all that are able to, we'd like for you to take your chairs and stack them up in the back against the wall, 7 high. Tina, do you have anything else?
I think so.
And we do have a few of our state representatives and our senators here, so I don't miss anybody. Can you stand? I know Stephen's here, and Scott's here, and Don's here, and Tracy Mann's here from Manhattan, his Dawson, and Clark Sanders is coming in. Did I miss anybody? Thank you very much for being here. Appreciate it. Okay, Kris, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you. Well, I'll stand on the stage, I guess. Anyway, it's great to be with you guys. Great to be back in front of the Granny Brigade. I think the last time might have been 3 or 4 years ago. But I'm going to talk about judicial selection because it is a subject I am passionate about. I will happily answer questions about the campaign, about a whole bunch of issues. I'll give you the 1-minute elevator pitch on the campaign. Lowest crime rate in 56 years. 23 crimes per 1,000 people per year. It's incredible. First drop in fentanyl deaths in the history of fentanyl. We just achieved it last year, just the stats that just came in at the beginning of this year, 17% drop in fentanyl deaths. During the Biden administration last 2 years, Kansas sued more times led more lawsuits against Biden than any other state except one that tied with us, and that was Texas. So don't mess with Kansas either, is the bumper sticker. And we have brought a huge number of lawsuits outside of the Biden administration, and I'll just mention 2 real quick, and again, I'll take questions on all these later. One you probably heard about in 2020, at the end of 2023, Kansas and Texas are the only 2 states to take on Pfizer for misleading consumers about the impact of their COVID vaccine. Specifically, they said it was safe for pregnant women when their own study showed alarmingly 10% miscarriage rate, and that's just shocking. And the other big lawsuit that you might have read about in the news is that Kansas is one of the leading states taking on Live Nation Ticketmaster for its monopoly, which has been gouging concert goers in Kansas and every other state for more than 10 years now. And we won at trial last week with the finding that they indeed were engaging in monopoly exclusionary practices. And that's why you pay $300 for a concert ticket when, just a couple decades ago we were paying $30 for that same ticket. Anyway, so doing everything we can to use this office for the betterment of Kansas. I love this job. That's why I'm not running for governor. I'll let the others do that, and they're welcome to it. But no, this job offers I've just never been in something that's so much in my wheelhouse. I love to get in court and argue myself, and I love to move the needle for conservative issues. Okay, so let's talk about judicial selection. As you know, the Kansas legislature passed in 2025 a constitutional amendment which goes to the people. It passed it with exactly the number of votes necessary to win, 2/3 to the vote in both the House and the Senate. This is something that if it's achieved, if we get a 50% plus one vote of the people of Kansas in August, it will be truly historic. It'll be generational. It'll be something that affects not only us in this room, it'll affect our kids, our grandchildren, and their grandchildren. Because it will change the ability of conservative Kansas laws to stand. Because right now, every time a conservative Kansas law is passed by the legislature, if it is an issue of any controversy at all, school funding, taxes, guns, trans issues, abortions, if it covers any field that's remotely politically controversial, there will be a lawsuit in Kansas court. It will go to the Kansas Supreme Court, and 9 times out of 10, they're going to rule against the legislature. Okay, so let me give you a little bit of where we are. Kansas has what's called the Missouri model of selecting judges, which should have been our first clue that it was a bad idea. They adopted it in 1958 after this thing called the triple play, which I'll tell you. So we used to elect our judges. We elected our judges from statehood until 1958 for about 100 years. And it worked out extremely well. Then in 1958, or it might have been the 56 election, the incumbent governor lost his bid for re-election, so he was a lame duck for a couple of months from November to January. And his buddy on the Supreme Court, he wanted to be on the Kansas Supreme Court. He didn't want to give up working in Topeka. So his buddy on the Kansas Supreme Court resigned, and then he resigned as governor, and the lieutenant governor, also his buddy, became governor and appointed him to the Kansas Supreme Court. And it was called the triple play because it was 3 steps. And the way vacancies were filled on the Supreme Court was the gubernatorial appointment, obviously. Well, in 1958, they threw the baby out with the bathwater. The problem was not with elections. In fact, the problem was with the absence of an election. The problem was with the mechanism whenever there's a vacancy. They just let the governor do it. So there was a movement, a progressive movement at the time. And the progressive movement of the 1940s and 50s and 30s was that government knows best. That government experts, that's when so many agencies in the federal government were created. It's because these agencies have experts, and these experts know more than you and me. These experts are much smarter than regular people. And so that's when all these agencies, and it was part of the progressive movement of that age. And unfortunately, some of our Republican heroes were part of the progressive movement. Teddy Roosevelt, unfortunately, loved everything else he did. He was a progressive. His cousin, FDR, was also a progressive. This idea that government knows better than the people. And so the idea was, we're going to put experts in charge of selecting our Supreme Court justices, not the unwashed masses of people who aren't smart enough to make these decisions. And they created the Missouri model. They adopted the Missouri model, which started in Missouri. And the way it works is a commission, a 9-member commission of experts decides which 3 candidates for the Supreme Court go to the governor. The governor has to choose one of those 3 people. And the commission has 9 members, but 5 have to be attorneys. And the chairman of the commission has to be an attorney. Guess who gets to select those attorneys? Only lawyers. So if you have a bar license, which I do, of course, you get a letter in the mail every so often whenever there's a vacancy on the selection commission saying, who would you like to put on the selection commission? Well, lawyers, unfortunately, are disproportionately left-leaning, and so they put a bunch of very left-leaning people on the commission, and what routinely happens is the 4 lay members of the commission, who are appointed by the governor, will choose a candidate to be one of the 3 who's more conservative.
And the 5 lawyers will squash that person every time. And there was testimony in front of the Kansas legislature about this very fact. So anyway, this commission has produced one of the most liberal, left-leaning activist Supreme Courts in the country. I say this because I've argued in front of the Kansas Supreme Court many times. I've also argued in front of other Supreme Courts, including the California Supreme Court, which I believe is the only Supreme Court that is more activist and left-leaning than Kansas. Can I prove that, other than having argued in front of them? Sure. The Kansas Supreme Court has been overturned 82.5% of the time over the last 15 years when its decisions go to the U.S. Supreme Court. 7 out of the 8 decisions that went to the Supreme Court most recently from the Kansas Supreme Court were overturned by the U.S. Supreme Court. 2 of those were the cases involving the infamous Carr brothers, the mass murderers in Wichita, and both of them were attempts by the Kansas Supreme Court to suspend or set aside the death penalty. And the first case comes up, the U.S. Supreme Court flips Kansas again, after flipping them on just about everything. And then the case comes back, and Justice Scalia, in the oral argument, says, asking the attorney in the case, do the Kansas Supreme Court justices actually read our opinions? And then in the actual opinion, the Supreme Court voted against the Kansas Supreme Court 8-1, including all of the liberal justices except Sotomayor, and they said scathing things about the reasoning of the Kansas Supreme Court, saying that it was far-fetched and it was beyond the pale. And very rarely does the Supreme Court speak in derogatory terms about the decision below. But in the case of our Kansas Supreme Court, they have, because they have not yielded good decisions. They bend over backward to bend the law to the left, or to bend the meaning of the Constitution, so much so that the U.S. Supreme Court has noticed it and has criticized our court. So the defenders of the Missouri model say, well, it produces merit. It's a merit-based system. No, and elections are political. No, it's political behind closed doors. And there's no merit because there's no accountability. The only accountability is the mirage of accountability by these retention elections every 7 years, where you get to vote, shall so-and-so remain in office. That's not an election. I'd like an election like that this year. Shall Kris Kobach remain in office? I'm going to win that big time if it's like that. Because I'm not an opponent. There's nobody to advertise against you. There's nobody else to get out there and say, yeah, Kris did this wrong, that wrong, and another thing wrong. If you don't have an opponent, it's a cakewalk. It's not an election. And by the way, since 1958, in the 60-some years, or 60-some years, 68 years that we've had it, there has not been a single retention election in which the incumbent justice lost. So that just shows what a sham they are. So we've got a court that is frequently overturned. We've got a court that the Supreme Court has chastised, and the liberal justices on the Supreme Court have voted against their opinions. What else have they done? They have shredded our Kansas Constitution. They've invented an abortion right out of thin air, an invisible abortion right. The framers of the Kansas Constitution in 1859 were not trying to protect abortion rights, but our justices said, oh yes, in the word liberty, if you peel under the letters, you can see abortion. And it's ridiculous. They've also said that ever since 2005, with the Montoy decision, they said that the legislature does not have the last word on school funding for K through 12 schools. And they said it's unconstitutional for the legislature not to spend enough money. Well, how do they get that conclusion? The Kansas Supreme Court in 1859, when there were not many there were some public schools, but in much of this frontier state didn't have public schooling available, they wrote the following sentence into the Constitution of Kansas. They said, the legislature shall make suitable provision for the financing of public schools. That's all. Funding of public schools. Suitable provision for the funding of public schools. That means, to anyone who's familiar with the English language, that means you'll come up with some system of property taxes or sales taxes or some kind of taxes, and you'll find a way to fund schools. But what the Kansas Supreme Court did in 2005, and has done in 5 separate decisions since then, has said, oh, we're going to take the word suitable out of context, and we're going to change it to adequate, and we're going to say the legislature shall put an adequate amount of money in public schools. Now, that's not what it said. It said suitable provision for financing. That means come up with a way to do it, not the amount of money that you do. And as a result, they've given themselves the right to say whenever the legislature appropriates an amount of money that some school districts want to sue about and say it's not enough, the Kansas Supreme Court says, nope, not enough, and tells the legislature, you've got to meet these minimums. No other state has seen the Supreme Court of that state take over K through 12 financing. I can give you other examples of bad decisions. If you want more, I could. There's a really interesting one about immigration, but I'll keep going. So they produce bad decisions. They're frequently flipped by the United States Supreme Court. How does that affect my job? I'll tell you how. So when the ACLU challenges conservative law in Kansas, do they throw every argument they have at it? That's what you would do in any other state. That's what you would do in any other court. If you were challenging a state law, if you had some state arguments based on the state constitution, and you might want to argue that it violates the federal statutes or federal constitution, you put everything on the table. That's what a good lawyer does, and see if the judge agrees with any of it. They don't do that in Kansas. When the ACLU sues, like they're suing right now in a case that I am litigating myself, defending our state law, saying you can't change the sex on a driver's license or a birth certificate, and that men's rooms are for biological men and women's rooms in government buildings for biological women. Very sensible law, a law that 20 years ago you would have never thought we even need to pass. The ACLU brought that lawsuit. They had possible federal claims. They had none of them are very good, but possible claims under the U.S. Constitution, and they had this possible claim under the Kansas Constitution. They swept all of the federal claims off the table, and they only go with Kansas state constitutional claims. And they do this all the time, not just with trans issues, on abortion, any issue, school finance. They ignore the federal constitution. No plaintiff's attorney outside of Kansas does that. Why? Because they don't want it to be appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court. There's a rule. In order for a case to be appealed to the United States Supreme Court from a state Supreme Court, there has to be a federal question. Either that or diversity jurisdiction, where the plaintiff and the defendant are from opposing states, but that doesn't usually get to the Supreme Court. A federal question. Well, there's no federal question if you only base it on the state constitution. And so this is a game that the ACLU lawyers play, and the Kansas Supreme Court knows exactly what the game is. And so when they issue a decision, they could cite a bunch of federal precedents about U.S. law and the U.S. Constitution, but they intentionally don't even mention the U.S. Constitution. They only talk about the state constitution because they do not want to be appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court. They don't want the U.S. Supreme Court to review the case. And so that is the situation we're in. So when I go to court to defend our statutes, I know that they're just going to, the plaintiffs, the ACLU, will be bringing crazy arguments to twist the meaning of the state constitution, and the Kansas Supreme Court will likely agree, unfortunately, with many of those arguments. And that's why having a Supreme Court that is fair, that just reads the law as it is, doesn't try to change the meaning of the Constitution, doesn't try to change the meaning of statutes, will change everything in this state. So many issues. I mean, you name the issue, it will change the decision. This case that I'm arguing right now, defending our law on not changing birth certificates and driver's licenses, that one is eventually going to make it to the Supreme Court of Kansas. But I pray, it's in district court right now, so we've got several more stages. I pray it will get there after we've passed this amendment and after the first round of justices have been elected. Okay, so with all of these problems in our Kansas Supreme Court, that pushed me to help urge my friends in the legislature to let's make a run at it, and let's try to go to electing our justices. So we did a poll, my PAC did a poll in January of 2025, and we asked Kansans, if you were given the choice between the Kansas Supreme Court and the federal model, where the governor would nominate and the Senate would confirm, which would you choose? And the people said 45 to 38. 45% would choose the federal model, 38 would choose the current system. Then we asked them, if you were given a choice between electing your justices and the current system, which would you choose? 70 to 23. The people of Kansas would rather elect their justices, just like we did for a century. And that information, I think, inspired many of the legislators, including those in this room, to say, you know what, let's go, we want to have a different system, but let's go with the system that the people want. And frankly, it's the most common system. 22 of the states elect their justices. That is the most common model. Once we approve this constitutional amendment, we'll be number 23. Only 14 have the Missouri model, and then the others have a smattering of different systems that they use. But I feel very confident that we can win this amendment. And if we do win this referendum on the constitutional amendment, it will change everything. It will, like I say, when our legislators pass laws, they won't have to worry about whether or not the Supreme Court's going to let it stand, because if they follow the Constitution, which they do, and follow the state constitution, which they do, and draft a law that is reasonable, which they always do, it will survive almost certainly in a fair state Supreme Court, because that's the way the rest of the country works, with the exception of California. That's what we're going to do. I was involved in drafting the amendment with our legislators. It's 4 sentences long, and the reason it's only 4 sentences long was to keep it simple. That was one of the problems, I think, with the Value Them Both amendment in 2022. Many of you may remember it. It was kind of a word salad. It was very wordy, lots of stuff thrown in there. This one is 4 sentences. The first sentence says, the people of Kansas who are qualified electors, the citizens of Kansas who are qualified electors shall elect their Supreme Court. The second sentence says, the rules and the districts for such elections shall be decided by law, meaning by the legislature. Third sentence says the first 3 positions will be elected in 2028, then 2 in 2030, and 2 in 2032. And then they'll have 6-year terms thereafter. And the fourth sentence says, in the case of a vacancy, it shall remain open until the next even year election, solving the triple play problem. So that's the amendment, and it will work wonders in the quality of our Supreme Court and in the decisions that come out of our state Supreme Court. And I really believe that this is, many of our legislators here, many of you who are involved in government or in political activism in one way or another, there are lots of causes, there are lots of things we try to achieve each year. There are lots of elections you might be involved in. But if we get this one across the line, I think it'll be the biggest political improvement reform that we have made in Kansas in our lifetimes. It's that big because it affects all of the other issues. So we are now entering into the phase of the final sprint here. I mean, we're almost to May, and this thing, we've got May, June, July, basically, and of course those who are involved in primaries know that the beginning of August is where it all happens, and that's where this one happens too. And so I'm going to encourage you. They aren't printed yet, but my PAC is printing highway signs and yard signs that say "Choose Democracy," which I love because the Democrats are going to like that. And we will have them available for you. We should have a bunch of them available to have someone bring over here for your May meeting. And I encourage you to put those in your yards, and we'll have them along the highways. And it's, we're going to make sure Kansans know that they have the opportunity to return us to a democratically selected Supreme Court that is accountable to the people. I'll give you a couple more arguments, and then I'll take your question. A couple more arguments for you to use if you're, talking over the backyard fence to your neighbor or at the workplace, persuading people, because I need you guys to persuade people that this is what we need to do. One of the studies that's been done, in fact, the only book that's been written on this topic, has tried to assess the quality of justices. Now, assessing the quality of a judge is kind of hard to do, right? You don't get a score at the end of every opinion you write. You don't get a letter grade or an end of the year percentage. But they did find some ways you could measure quality of justices. One is, or quality of a Supreme Court. One is, are other courts around the country quoting your opinions? If it's a really good opinion, then other courts in other states may quote it as an example of how some issue should be decided. And they found that elected Supreme Courts are significantly higher, they do better than these Missouri model courts in being quoted by other courts, which is a measure of quality. They also said speed of writing their opinions. There are a lot of judges don't have an obligation to write things fast. If a judge wants to sit on a case for 2 years, he or she can sit on that case for 2 years. And justice delayed is justice denied, but it doesn't matter to them. They just wait. So they looked at speed of writing opinions. Elected judges write their opinions faster than unelected Missouri model type judges. And so these measures of quality show a significant benefit when you elect your justices. But the most important thing is they're accountable. There's somebody to run against them. So if some justice on the Kansas Supreme Court comes up with the opinion that, there's another invisible right in our Constitution, maybe an invisible right to change your birth certificate any way you want, then the opponent can run against them in the next cycle and say, hey, I would not have decided that. I think that is a misinterpretation of our Constitution. And you will have competition. Just like Kris Mann will try to convince you, it's a rematch, by the way, in my race. Kris Mann, the guy I beat 3.5 years ago, is going to come out and say, Kris Kobach has been a horrible attorney general. And he's going to try to convince you, but that's how our system works. It's not pretty, but it works because both sides have an incentive to inform you as much as they can about why their candidate is better. And the same applies with justices too. They will be accountable to the people. One last note. So the other side will say, this is one of their arguments, our judges are not for sale. They've already started producing literature saying, and they're going to have yard signs saying, our courts should not be for sale. And now their argument is kind of a complicated one. They're suggesting that because you have elections involve advertising, advertising involves paying for advertising and fundraising. When people give money, they might give money with an expectation that you will, do something in their benefit. And so therefore, the courts are going to be for sale. Well, no, but it's a long-winded argument, which is why it's a losing argument. It doesn't fit on a yard sign, by the way. But they're going to say our courts should not be for sale. Well, if you look, their argument is there's going to be so much money coming into these elections. And then the one example they always point to, if you give them a microphone and they can talk about it, they say, look what happened in Wisconsin in 2025. Over $50 million was spent in a race for one Supreme Court justice, and it was in the month of April. Well, that's the key. Wisconsin's constitution says that their Supreme Court elections have to be in April, when no other elections are occurring throughout the country, which means that there was no other place for the political money to go, and all attention there wasn't even any other election in Wisconsin. So all of the money can just go into this race, and it happened to be a split 4-3 court, and this was the swing seat. And so, yeah, a lot of money was spent in Wisconsin. And oh, by the way, it was a statewide election, meaning all of the voters in the state could vote on it. I think they're roughly twice the size of us. I think they have 7 or 8 congressional districts. But in Kansas, we're much smaller, and we the legislature, I think, will probably choose to have districts, 7 districts. So each justice is from a certain part of Kansas. That means that you're only advertising to 1/7 of the population of Kansas. And when you look at states that have elections that are in districts like that, the numbers are really small. I haven't memorized them, but I remember a couple of them. I think in Mississippi, in Oregon, the amount spent per election was $25,000. In, I think it was Alabama, the amount spent per election on average was about $70,000. And in a couple of states, the election, I think Louisiana, it was about $250,000. $250,000 is not a lot of money in terms of an election for a state Supreme Court. Many of the state senators here have probably spent in excess of $50,000 in their races. That's kind of a typical number. So, and it's not in an attorney general race. Both candidates are going to spend well over $1 million, and the gubernatorial race is going to spend well over $2, $3, $4 million. So it's not expensive. So our judges are not going to be for sale. And oh, by the way, there's a code of judicial ethics where any judge who's actually bribed or bought can be kicked out of office. And by the way, we also have elected judges at the district level in half of Kansas's courts. So they're not buying verdicts at the district level. It's never happened before. And the other side can't show any example of this actually happening. So those are the arguments. We're going to win, but it requires you guys to help make the case. Take a yard sign next month when we have some over here for you to take them. Just persuade your neighbors. I mean, people already lean in favor of electing our judges. Because as the polling indicates, and it wasn't just that poll I did in January of 2025, there's been another poll that we did at the end of last year, the same result. It was almost 70 again. And the other interesting thing, and I'll leave you with this before I take questions, the polling shows that Democrats want to elect our justices just as much as Republicans do. Why? It's in their party name, right? They're for democracy, in theory. Maybe not the ones in Congress or the ones in the legislature, but the rank and file people who, registered Democrat, they choose that for a reason, and many of them, most of them, the vast majority of them, believe in elections. And so that's why we chose Choose Democracy as the theme on our signs. So thank you for letting me speak with you, and I will take any question you want to fire at me on anything.
Thank you. I have many questions for you.
All
that
right,
have been
well,
turned in.
I will have many answers,
All right.
but only one per question. Well, I take that back, maybe two. Okay.
This question has come up many times. When or where or how is it possible to look up those Kansas Supreme Court cases that have been overturned?
It's very hard because there's no website you can go to that says, here are the cases that have been overturned by the Kansas Supreme Court. I have most of them memorized. The two Carr brothers cases, the Kansas versus Garcia, which is one where the Kansas Supreme Court said that that our law against identity theft, our Kansas law against identity theft, is unconstitutional, preempted by federal law, because that might discourage some illegal aliens from remaining in the country, and that's the federal government's job, not our job. Crazy decision. The U.S. Supreme Court flipped that one as well. I don't think I can come up with the majority of them. It was in my legislative testimony. We should probably put that on a website. It was in my legislative testimony to the two houses when we got this thing through. But yeah, there's no website that you can't just Google it. And you can't ask Grok or Snapchat. They won't know either. They make stuff up, by the way. Don't trust them. And they're sycophantic and they're bad for your kids. You want to know my opinions about AI chatbots? They're bad. All right, so yeah, we'll try to put that on the website for our side, which I can't remember if anyone on my staff remembers the name of the website. It's an easier to remember. Anyway, we'll get the word out where you can go for that.
If I could piggyback on that with other questions, the shall this judge be retained question that has been on our...
That'll be gone. Those fake elections will no longer exist.
Is there a way to find out the voting record or case judgments that were for each of those judges?
No, that's part of the problem, is that there's no easy way to see all of the decisions. A given Supreme Court justice may, over the course of 7 years, or 6 years, no, 7 years, they may issue or sign on to certainly over 300 opinions. And there's no place that shows all the votes. It would be nice if there was a website that summarized each case, showed how each justice voted, but there is no such thing. And so you may recall back in, I want to say maybe 2016 or 2018, I think it was 2018, there were 6 justices who happened to be all up for retention in the same year. And there was a campaign to try to unseat them, a conservative effort. And you got mailings, you got stuff in your mailbox, you may not remember it, trying to show you on a little postcard how bad the decisions were. But it's a lot of information, and those of us who wanted to see if we could use the current system to get rid of the justices, weren't able to get past that 50% line. It's just hard to inform voters when it's just third parties saying, okay, let's try to inform everybody. You need an opposing candidate who has the incentive to raise the money and to run hard and go speak at every gathering they can find to oppose a judicial candidate.
Thank you. This question says, I have a real ID driver's license. When they vote to have to prove citizenship to vote, will my real ID prove that I am a citizen?
Yes, it will. And I can tell you that because I drafted the first law, which your legislators passed in 2011, requiring Kansans to prove that they are U.S. citizens when registering to vote. I know about it because that was the whole reason I ran for Secretary of State. Looking back, that was a cause I really believed in and still believe in. It's not nearly as fun as being Attorney General, but that was my thing. That was what I was trying, my holy grail, and we got it through the legislature. The majority of Democrats voted for it, by the way. That's before photo ID and proof of citizenship became racist. It became racist in 2012 when Bill Clinton said it's racist. And so anyway, it passed overwhelmingly, and then the ACLU sued. They drew the most liberal federal judge in the Kansas system, in the federal system for the District of Kansas, and then they drew a very liberal, randomly selected panel on the 10th Circuit, the Court of Appeals, and they overturned our proof of citizenship requirement on the most preposterous grounds. But anyway, when we wrote the first one, and when the legislature, I hope, has a chance to write the next one, you make available every document that proves U.S. citizenship. So it'd be your passport, your birth certificate if you're born in the United States, a military document that indicates citizenship, a naturalization document if you were an alien and you became a citizen, and the real ID driver's license if you have the yellow star in the corner. And the purpose of that star is there are a whole bunch of purposes, but it can also serve to establish that you are a citizen for voting purposes. So we listed all those documents. In fact, in 2011, the real ID licenses hadn't yet come into practice, but we knew that they were going to do that. So we even said, if it has an indicator on the face of the license that you're a US citizen, that counts. Why am I optimistic we're going to have another crack at it, since some very liberal judges struck ours down? Because there's a case approaching the Supreme Court right now. They haven't said whether they're going to take it or not. But Arizona has a proof of citizenship law very similar to what Kansas had. The Ninth Circuit ruled against it, struck it down, and they are appealing to the US Supreme Court. And Kansas led a multi-state Republican AG amicus opinion for certiorari, which means basically it's a friend of the court opinion telling the Supreme Court, you really ought to take this one. And if they do take this one, I'm very confident the US Supreme Court will rule our way. The US Supreme Court didn't take our Kansas appeal in 2016 to get it to the US Supreme Court, probably because it was the first time a case came to them presenting that question. They usually wait until the second or the third case, and there's some division among the courts below. So we'll see. If the Supreme Court takes it, it'll be a great day for Kansas, because they will sustain the Arizona law. I'm very confident. And when that happens, the Kansas legislature will have a basis for passing another proof of citizenship law with the new Supreme Court precedent backing it up. So, God willing, we'll have another crack at that one.
This question, I believe, is in reference to the constitutional amendment referendum you were just speaking about. It says, I'm glad to hear you are confident we can pass this, but please talk about how much opposition there will be.
So the opposition has already started pounding their chests and bragging. The opposition is, I can't remember I can't remember what their name they came up with is, but it's basically three groups. It's the teachers' unions, because they want to keep a court that will take the legislature's power of spending away. The Planned Parenthood, because they want to keep a court that will continue to use an invisible right to an abortion. And the Trial Lawyers Association, because our current left-leaning court works to the benefit of trial lawyers. And so those three organizations have pooled their money, and they have been saying publicly they have $1.4 million. Well, that's a lot of money, but we've got a lot of money too. This time around, it's going to be a fair fight, and we might even have more money than the other side. An organization called First Principles, which is a conservative organization seeking judicial reform of this nature across the country, sees Kansas as the test case. If we pass this in Kansas, they're going to try to pass the same elected justices constitutional amendment in Utah, in Montana, Utah, Idaho, and Missouri. Wouldn't that be beautiful if Missouri rejected the Missouri model? Anyway, so they have put $1.2 million in already in advertisements. Americans for Prosperity has been knocking door to door in Topeka, Wichita, and the Kansas City metro area, and has been doing so for several months already. They're going to be spending, I don't know what the total dollar figure is, but they'll easily spend over $500,000. My PAC will be doing a lot of the stuff, including the signs and a lot of the advertising. We're going to spend, I would estimate, depending on how much we raise, it'll certainly be over $500,000 and maybe a lot more than that. So we have groups on our side who are determined to win this thing. They see it as not just Kansas, they see it as part of a national movement that Kansas is going to start. And so yeah, the other side, they've gotten together, they've raised some money, and don't be mistaken, there will be lots of advertisements about this, and they will say, our court's for sale, elections are bad. Isn't it funny though, how elections for justices are bad, but an election for an attorney general is okay? I mean, it's basically the same qualities, right? You need to be able to articulate legal questions and arguments. You need to be able to assess the law fairly, and you need to be, smart enough to do it well. Those are the same things that a judge is supposed to do. But apparently, you can have elections for attorney general, but not for our precious judges. They don't need elections. So anyway, you're going to see all kinds of arguments. You're going to hear dark money all the time, because there's money and there's dark money, and dark money is really bad, and that's going to buy our judges. But we have the better arguments, and I'm convinced if we go toe to toe in terms of the money spent, doors knocked on, people like us talking, I think we're going to win this thing.
on that same category, if there is an opening on the state Supreme Court, what happens if there is a tie?
That's interesting. The legislature would write that rule. So currently in Kansas law, if there's an election, if there's a tie in an election, usually the first thing that would happen would be there would be a recount. It would happen automatically because it's that close. And if after the recount there was still a tie, then with elections for other offices, Kansas has drawing by lots, which is like a coin toss. Randomly choose who the winner is. It has virtually never happened, but it has actually happened in a couple of state legislative races. I wouldn't say virtually never, like once every 10 years or so, there will be a tie in a state legislative race, and it will be drawn by lot who the winner is. So the legislature can decide what would happen in the case of a tie for a Supreme Court race. But, it's not really likely statewide. It doesn't really happen statewide because there's so many votes cast. There will be 1 million votes cast in the general election for governor and attorney general this coming November. That's how many were spent, how many voted in 4 years ago. So when you have 1 million votes cast, it's pretty hard to come up with a 50-50 tie.
This question says, as Attorney General, your job is to uphold Kansas law. Do you accept the Kansas Supreme Court's ruling in the vote of the people on the outcome of the 22 Kansas abortion referendum as settled law, or would you actively try to challenge and overturn that?
So the Kansas Supreme Court didn't rule on the 2022 referendum. They have tried to extrapolate. I mean, this just shows how activist our court is. Once the Kansas Constitution passes or doesn't pass, that's it. Either it becomes part of our Constitution or it doesn't. The Kansas Supreme Court doesn't get to say yes or no or amend it or anything. The Kansas Supreme Court has used, this just shows how political they are, they have used that failed vote in 2022 to say the people of Kansas want abortion. No, that's not what the vote was on. As you recall, the question was, shall the legislature have the ability to regulate abortion within certain limits defined in the law? So, the more activist members of the Supreme Court have tried to sort of use that amendment, but there's never been a Supreme Court ruling on that attempted amendment in 2022.
This question says, is there a way to remove books from our school and public libraries that contain graphic sexual content?
Yeah, absolutely. It's the school boards are the ones who should ultimately have, the librarians should be doing it, then the principals if the librarian isn't, and then the superintendent, and if the superintendent isn't doing it, the school board should. But absolutely, districts can and should remove material that is not suitable for students of whatever age the school is. There's no First Amendment right of authors to have your books in every school you want them to be in. There are First Amendment rights that apply in elementary schools and in high schools, but the notion that a library has to cover everything, has to include everything no matter how obscene or how profane it is not correct. In fact, there is an obscenity, I would call it an exception. There's an obscenity exception to the First Amendment that the U.S. Supreme Court has recognized for, what year was that opinion? It was recognized for almost 50 years. The First Amendment does not protect obscenity.
This is referencing dogs specifically. It says, in the state of Texas, dog owners are held liable for any harm done to another dog or person. Penalties can go up to a Class 2 felony. Animals, dogs and cats, but mainly dogs, are an issue right now in Salina. Is there any conversation in Topeka regarding dog attacks?
Not that I'm aware of, but there could be if you want to have your legislators here bring it up. I'm not aware of any bills. Maybe the legislators in the room can correct me if there was one. Was there one, Scott?
We had a feral cat bill.
Feral cat bill. Well, if it's feral, it doesn't have an owner, right? So that would be different. But there's absolutely nothing. This is what your state legislature, all the purview, the way our framers designed our system, the states already existed. And state legislatures control, they have what are called police powers. It has nothing to do with red lights and people with guns. Police powers means that your state legislature can pass whatever law they want for the health, safety, welfare, and morality of the people of Kansas. So if that law that you're thinking of would improve the health or safety or welfare or morality, your Kansas legislature can do it, providing it doesn't violate the U.S. Constitution or the Kansas Constitution. In contrast, Congress, and most congressmen don't know this, they only have the powers that are listed in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, which is a very small list. They can't just do anything they want for the welfare of the people of America. So anyway, that bill would, that issue would fit very well into a state bill.
This question is regarding KORA violations.
Cora?
KORA, K-O-R-A,
Yeah, yeah.
Kansas Open Records. Why are complainants not contacted before cases are closed, and why does it take the highest paid staff to assemble KORA requests?
No, I know what the highest paid step. So when you you or anyone make a KORA request, you're requesting an open record from the relevant government agency. The agency has a statutory obligation to get back to you within 3 days and to tell you what answering your request would involve and how many pieces of paper approximately it's likely going to be and how many hours of man hours of personnel time it would take to do all of the searches, run all, go sift through all of the documents to make sure they apply, and then make all the copies and then send you and so there's a cost estimate that's put on it. And the questioner is correct. There's no fixed cost in Kansas law. So I was just talking to the Ellsworth County Sheriff, and they get lots of KORA requests, whenever there's an accident on one of the highways that goes through Ellsworth County or anything like that. And he says, well, we just charge the lowest rate of anybody in our office of any employee in our office. So it's we do it pretty cheap, but I know we don't have to do it that cheap. So it's up to each agency is the answer to your question. And so some agencies will say, well, our people are highly paid and you're going to have to pay them their freight. And then others will, be more reasonable. So there isn't a statutory standard saying what the rate has to be. It has to be fair. You don't charge the agency head's salary divided by hours per year. But you do have to estimate who's going to be doing it, who in the office, and what their salary or what their hourly wage is. So yeah, there's a huge disparity. You could if you're wanting information from Ellsworth County, you'll get a bargain. If you're wanting information from one of Governor Kelly's agencies, maybe not so much. So that's the short answer.
This question references HB 2444, criminal justice sentencing. It says, will it be overturned?
Okay, so the legislature has this wonderful practice of first a bill has a number when it's introduced, then inevitably it gets changed and it becomes a different number. And so usually about halfway through the legislative session, I stopped trying to memorize the numbers anymore. So I don't know, do any of our legislators know exactly which one 2444 was? Because in any given session there's multiple criminal justice bills. Anybody know?
It's the one where the sentencing guidelines and stuff that we changed all that.
Yeah.
And we made it more strict where if they are pronounced guilty, if they don't get on probation between times, they
Right.
have to start serving their sentence.
Yes. Okay, got it. I know which one you're talking about.
And I actually wrote that one because I'm like, now I'm already hearing already that it's going to be overturned, and we tried to do something that would help our public.
Well, tell me this, where have you heard that is there litigation? Has it already been challenged in court?
I just heard from a lawyer friend that they
Oh.
were already looking at it.
So
we
they
already had the-
is probably the ACLU or some left-wing group, and they are probably trying to figure out if they can win. I am not aware of a case that's been filed yet, but there's a long way between the filing of a case and overturning it, and I think that one's going to be pretty hard to overturn. I mean, sentencing guidelines are done from the federal government down to every state in the union. It's the way we try to constrain judges from being arbitrary or being different. Like if you have a judge who's really lenient toward criminals and a judge who's a hanging judge, as they call him, and is super harsh toward criminals, you would have unfairness, right? Depending on which judge you got. And so that's why we have sentencing guidelines, which give the judge a minimum and a maximum for every category of crime. So sentencing guidelines have been tested in courts for decades, and they are perfectly fine. So the fact that we are tightening our sentencing guidelines a little bit, and the way we're counting days served is more rational. I sometimes can put myself in the mind of an ACLU attorney and think of what arguments I'd make. I can't think of any good arguments in that one. So I don't think that one is likely to be overturned. They may try, but I don't think they'll win.
This is a long question, so
Oh, boy.
if you need a sip of water, feel free.
All right, I'll have some water while you're asking.
And it says, this is an off-topic question for your current position, but with your years of political experience, why can we not seem to accomplish much meaningful legislation at the state and national levels? And it references property tax relief, voter ID, prosecuting fraud, etc., especially when conservatives have control of both state and national levels.
So I would disagree in one part with the premise of the question. I think our state legislature is passing a lot of meaningful legislation. I agree entirely that Congress is not. The main reason is that Congress has the Senate filibuster rule to overcome, and so even though we have Republican majorities in the House and the Senate, a majority is not good enough in the Senate. You need to get 60 votes, and so that's why ending the filibuster. The crazy thing about the filibuster is it's not in the Constitution, it's not in statute, it's just a Senate rule. And only 50 senators are necessary to change that rule, but it's part of the tradition of the U.S. Senate. So I agree. And that's the answer to the question, is the U.S. Senate is the stopping point for good, beneficial laws that Congress is trying to pass, that the Republicans are trying to pass. In the state legislature, our state legislature churned out a bunch of really good laws this session, and almost all of them were vetoed by the governor. The governor set a record for vetoes. Does anybody know what the number was? 19, 20?
20 and 20.
20 and 20.
29 vetoes and 20.
Okay, so
40 votes.
yeah, so 20 vetoes of laws that aren't budget bills. That's extraordinary, and our legislature, I think, set a record on the number of them that were overturned. It was 18 or 19, and almost all except one or two, I think, were overturned. And so we have been governing, the Republicans, conservatives of Kansas, have been governing through our elected representatives by veto override. And it's been pretty darn impressive how our legislature has hung together and overridden the governor on so many of those vetoes. So yes, there are a lot of things that we didn't get, like we want more significant tax reform, especially property tax reform. Don't get me started on that one. But they still got a lot done. And the things that they couldn't get were because there were just not quite enough people to override the veto. Let me give you one example that I'm really frustrated about, but I'm still giving compliments to the legislature because they did so much else. And that is giving in-state tuition to illegal aliens. I have been fighting against this since 2004 when Governor Sebelius and a bunch of Democrats and some foolish Republicans decided to enact that into Kansas law. Congress in 1996 passed a statute saying, in so many words, you shall not give in-state tuition to illegal aliens unless you give it to every U.S. citizen. Makes sense, right? Why would you treat illegal aliens better than someone who wants to come to college in Kansas from Nebraska or Oklahoma or Colorado? Why would you do that? There's no good reason to do that. Anyway, Kansas just violated the federal law. And I have been pushing and testifying in front of the legislature and tried again this year. The House had the votes to overturn the governor's veto, but the Senate at the last minute, a few of them went squishy and offered some very bad reasons. I was even in the room and explained how it violates the law. And several Republican senators said, well, I don't care. Or in some they didn't say the words, I don't care, but they said, well, yeah, it might violate the law, but I still want to do it. In what universe is that okay for legislators to say it's okay for us legislators to violate the law when we're passing laws and telling everybody else you have to follow the law? Anyway, that's what happened, and we were a few votes short. So I too share the frustration that some really common sense bills that are absolutely necessary for Kansas did not get passed by the Kansas legislature. But I still give them a B+ because they got so many bills passed over the governor's veto. So that's my answer.
This question has to do with the whole Islamification thing that's going on. What steps are being taken to keep Sharia law out of Kansas?
Well, there was actually a bill that was passed, if I'm not mistaken, about 10 years ago to restrict Sharia law being used and forced upon people in Kansas. There's this, that said, if a Muslim mosque within its members, congregation, wants to encourage people to do things a certain way, that's fine, they can, but they cannot break state law, they cannot break federal law, they cannot break local ordinances, they cannot do things to people that are illegal. And so, yeah, they could, Sharia law in the sense of norms of conduct within that faith, yeah, they can have that. But can they actually have binding rules that supersede our established laws of Kansas? No. Can they punish people? No. And that's where I'm sure we've all read about some of these, horrific, I can't remember the term for it, but when a father punishes his daughter for, violating these rules. Honor, yes. That violates U.S. law. Well, it violates state law in many ways, and in some cases it violates federal law.
This question says, I contacted the police regarding a phone text that was a scam. They wouldn't take any information because I had not lost any money yet. Who can we report phone numbers or websites to in order to track down these scam criminals?
You can report it to the scam hotline at the Attorney General's office. We actually have a hotline for that issue. And our Consumer Protection Division is actually one of the most active divisions in our entire agency, which is about 200 people. The work of the Consumer Protection Division covers everything where consumers in Kansas are misled, defrauded, companies misrepresent their product to them, and scams are a huge part of what they do. So go to ag.ks.gov, Attorney General, Kansas Government, and you'll see it. Go to Consumer Protection, you'll see the fraud hotline. Can they, if you've been defrauded and you've lost money and you've given money to a scammer, if the scammer is in the United States, probably they can help and get that money back. If the scammer is outside of the United States, highly unlikely that we'll be able to get the money back. But every year, we get over 3,000 calls, and we work on every single one of them to do whatever we can. There'll be a public service advertisement that's coming out in a few weeks, but we've synthesized it down to 3 rules. There's lots of other rules too. Common sense is the number one, and don't believe anything that someone tells you is another one that you don't know. The first one is that if you get a call from a government entity or a law enforcement entity saying you owe money, you owe a fine, you have to pay money to the government, that is a scam. The government, or if you get a text, the government and law enforcement agencies do not call people and they do not text people. Another one is, this rule is if you see a call coming in from an unknown number, don't answer it. Your phones all have voicemail. Let them leave a voicemail message. Don't answer the phone. And the third one is if anyone ever asks you to pay for something over the phone in Bitcoin, or digital currency, hang up the phone. That is a scam artist for sure. But these are so tricky and they're so good, and now they're using AI to imitate the voice of loved ones. That's going to get really tough. And I have to confess, I'll tell you this story. I actually almost fell victim to one of them. So I got a call about a year and a half ago at my office number, which was really curious, on the office phone, saying, Mr. Kobach, this is Sheriff, Deputy so-and-so, and I said his name really quickly, from the sheriff's office, and I'm calling to let you know that there's a warrant out for your arrest. And I said, really? And I was sort of skeptical, obviously, and I said, what's the warrant for? And he said, for unpaid fines. I'm like, okay, has my daughter been driving my truck around and scoffing parking violations or something? So I didn't dismiss it right away. I thought, well, maybe there's some way this could maybe be true. And so I kept asking him questions. I said, well, then let me pay the fine amount. I'd be happy to do that. And he said, well, no, we can't just do that. I said, well, why don't I just go down to the county sheriff's office, I know the sheriff, and pay the amount. I'll go right now. He said, no, I'm sorry, you don't. If you leave right now, you'll be arrested. And I said, well, how about if I turn myself in to my KBI agents and let them drive me down to the sheriff's office? No, you can't do that. And I realized this guy was giving the answer no to lots of reasonable solutions to this. And eventually I said, you might not know this, but I'm actually the chief law enforcement officer of the state of Kansas. He's like, no, you're not. And I said, yeah, I'm the attorney general. And then he hangs up the phone. So, anyway, but he had me going for about 30 seconds because I thought, well, maybe there's some unpaid parking ticket or something. So anyway, they are very persuasive and they are very determined to get your money. So beware. Just don't answer the phone calls you don't recognize.
This question says, are the Kansas taxpayers having to pay the bill for all of the Medicare and Medicaid fraud?
Yes, but indirectly. So The Medicaid is funded primarily by the federal government, but there's also a lot of state money there too. So yes, if there's fraud, we are paying through our state taxes, but we're also paying through the federal taxes for this fraud. And one of the reasons that every state has a Medicaid fraud prevention unit, which we do in our office, and they're always in the Attorney General's offices, is because there's so many federal dollars. So yes, we are losing both state taxes that we have paid and federal tax dollars that we have paid to Medicaid and other forms of welfare fraud. It's a big number. The number in Kansas per capita is not as big as it is in places like California and Minnesota, where there isn't a determined government effort to really crack down on fraud. But Kansas, we do have many audits. We also have an inspector general who serves under me, and he does these reports, which are fantastic, and show the scope of different forms of fraud. And the legislature is usually extremely responsive to those reforms, and will oftentimes, make change to those reports and make reforms to help reduce fraud. So yeah, we have it. Yes, it's in the millions of dollars, but it's not at the size and percentage and scale of some of those states that aren't trying to do it. In Kansas, we're trying to do something about it. It would be helpful if we had a Republican governor, because the Republican governor would be much more directed and focused at doing something about these agencies. Because remember, the fraud happens because the agencies under the governor's control aren't scrutinizing the applications and aren't scrutinizing the money going out the door and aren't scrutinizing who is asking for the money to the extent that they should be. And we're giving money to illegal aliens, and that's very well known. But the whole reason, well, I'll give you a little story here. The governor, I sued the governor because she was not following the U.S. Department of Agriculture's request for information about who was getting SNAP benefits in Kansas. SNAP is the new name for food stamps, right? And why wasn't she doing this? Federal law and state law say the governor, the secretary of the governor's secretary shall give this money to the U.S. Department, give this information if requested to the U.S. Department of Education. So I sued the governor for the second time because she was breaking the law and refusing to give the information. And during the course of the hearing, the governor's attorney had to formulate an argument as, well, why? Why wouldn't you give the federal government the information they wanted? And the information was simply a list of the people getting it. That's all. It's mostly federal money. And the governor said, well, we don't want that information shared with other agencies. What other agencies? Department of Homeland Security. Because they don't want illegal aliens who are receiving the money to be deported when we find out that someone was ineligible to receive it because they're not a U.S. citizen and they're illegally in the country. So that was the ultimate motivation. She was trying to protect, in my opinion, she didn't come out and say this, but because they were trying to shield it from federal agencies, the only agency that she would be wanting to shield, these people are not going to be owing taxes to the IRS. The only agency that she reasonably, that you can come up with a rationale would be Department of Homeland Security.
This question says, what is the primary concern with the ability to have a choice of gender on a driver's license if the license itself has a unique ID?
So that's a great question. And I'm arguing this very question in court. So why does the state have an interest in making sure that your driver's license has your biological sex? Your driver's license should be a canvas on which you can paint yourself. You can describe yourself as you wish. You can dress as you wish for the photo. It is a portrait of you that you show every law enforcement officer and every hotel clerk. And that's what it is. That's the view, is that you should be able to just say what you want to say on your driver's license. But the problem with that is that there are not that many objective features that are unchanging on your driver's license. Think about it. What on your driver's license is objective and cannot be changed? And so if an officer is trying to decide if it's this Joe Smith or that Joe Smith, what's objective? The only things that are objective are your date of birth, your eye color, and your sex. Everything else changes. Your height changes, your weight changes, your appearance changes, your hair color changes, but those are the only three objective, unchanging things. And so law enforcement has an interest in maximizing the amount of objective information on a driver's license. And it goes beyond that. In the first of the trials on this issue back in 2023, the sheriff of Shawnee County testified that his officers had encountered individuals who are trying to evade arrest warrants by changing their sex. That's an easy way to do it, because if the warrant says that Joe Smith, male, born on this date, is guilty of such and such and is being arrested by this we have a warrant out from this jurisdiction for his arrest, then the officer's first thing is, when standing at the roadside, because this guy's been speeding, okay, what's your name? Yeah, I'm looking at the driver's license, got it, okay. Our warrant is for a Josephine Smith, female, and this person is saying he's a male. And oh look, the driver's license backs him up, saying he's a male. You cannot make the arrest. And so it is a method for people who want to evade arrest to evade arrest. So those are two reasons why it actually is important. And you know, the other thing about driver's licenses are, they're not our property. They're not our canvases to do with as we wish. That's a government document. And if the government decides that it would be helpful for law enforcement for this thing to have accurate, objective information, it's the government's document. They can put whatever they want on it.
I think this is a follow-up question to that issue with gender issues. Do you anticipate this issue going to the courts, the driver's license and birth?
Yeah, it's already in the courts. So we passed, the legislature passed it the first time in 2023. The governor's office refused to implement it and refused to require biological sex in birth certificates and driver's licenses. And so I sued the governor, and we won in district court. The district court said, the law says what it says. It's clear, the governor has to follow it. And we got an injunction ordering the governor to follow it. Then we went to the Kansas Court of Appeals, which actually is almost as liberal as the Kansas Supreme Court. We got 3 very left-leaning judges, again, a random draw, and they ruled against it. And then it went to the Kansas Supreme Court. And if the Kansas Court of Appeals rules that a law in Kansas is illegal or unconstitutional, then the Kansas Supreme Court has a chance to immediately take the case. In every other issue of this magnitude, you would expect the Kansas Supreme Court to take the case. They didn't take the case. And I believe they did that deliberately, I could be wrong, but that meant that the injunction disappeared. And so this happened back in October. And so all of a sudden, people started coming in and changing their driver's licenses and birth certificates again. Oh, specifically driver's licenses. There was a judicial decree on birth certificates, a separate one in federal court. Anyway, and so at that point, we needed the legislature to, all they needed to do was just tweak a couple words that the Court of Appeals had twisted. And I think the first bill was fine, but the second bill was rock solid. There was no way you could do what the Court of Appeals did. And so they passed it and then added on the bathroom provision. And so now we're back in court, and I'm arguing it again at the district level. And I'll probably argue this one. I had someone else in my office do the Court of Appeals last time, but I'll probably argue this one all the way up. So yeah, it's in court. And it'll go to the Kansas Supreme Court, and I hope we have a different Kansas Supreme Court when it gets there.
This seems to follow that up. It's almost like we're having a conversation with this. Why do activist judges seem to be, and I'm not sure if the word is running or ruining the country?
I think it's ruining, although they're actually running Kansas. They're probably both. Yeah. They are running the country, and they are ruining the country. That's funny. So, I mean, look, the reason is that although we have a divided country and the divisions between our parties are probably greater than ever before, we have been winning. Our side, the more conservative side, has been winning in the state legislature, and setting aside the filibuster rule, has been controlling majorities in Congress for more time than the Democrats have. But whenever a conservative law is passed, the left engages in what's sometimes called lawfare. They're like, we don't need to win in the legislature. We can win in court because we know that we can go to the Ninth Circuit, or we can go to the DC Circuit, and we can go to these liberal parts of the federal courts, or we can sue in California, or we can sue in Kansas, and we'll win. And so they have recognized that defeat in the legislature is not the end of the story. They have a branch of government that is rife with lots of judicial activists, liberal judges, and that's why so many things have happened to ruin our country. However, in Kansas, the Kansas Supreme Court is a real problem, as I've described. But I don't want to be totally pessimistic. Our U.S. Supreme Court right now is the best any of us have ever seen in our lifetimes, unless you were born before 1937. This is the best Supreme Court we've had since 1936, and then 37 it got worse.
Wow.
So that's why you're seeing so many great decisions coming out of the U.S. Supreme Court right now. They don't all go Trump's way. Issues like tariffs, those are statutory interpretation questions, and the law is what it is, the way it's written. But on constitutional questions, the trans issue, equal protection, discrimination in college applications, all of these things are going the right way. The Dobbs decision of the U.S. Supreme Court on abortion, these are all great decisions that could not have happened with the Supreme Court of 25 years ago, or even with the Supreme Court of 15 years ago. So don't be too pessimistic. Things are really bad in the Kansas Supreme Court, but we're going to fix that.
This question, I believe you alluded to this in one of your answers, but how do you reconcile the influence of money on the outcomes of elections and what that means for electing justices, Supreme Court justices, I'm assuming?
Yeah, so I already pointed out that I don't think money is going to, change Supreme Court races. And I don't think there's going to be untold millions of dollars, as I mentioned, in states other than Wisconsin that hold their elections for Supreme Court justices on Tuesday after the second Monday. Tuesday after the first Monday in November. There's just not that much money floating around where the Supreme Court races, especially in smaller districts, are going to see that much money. So I don't think that's going to be a big factor. There is an underlying point, though, that I have a less happy answer. Yeah, money does affect elections. There's no question. If you have an incredibly qualified candidate and the other candidate spends 5 times as much money, especially if the qualified candidate isn't already well known to voters, so they already have an impression of him or her, then yes, the candidate who spends 5 times as much money, if they're equally well known, is probably going to win. And I've seen this, firsthand in my political career, going around the block as many times as I have. So yeah, it definitely has an effect on the winner, but I don't think that the problem of so much money being spent that you're going to have really bad candidates in judges winning is a problem. The other thing I'd say about judges is they're different. There's no qualifications for being a state senator or governor or treasurer. There really aren't. Anyone can do it. But with the office of judge, there are qualifications. You want someone who's probably got some judicial experience, especially Supreme Court justice. Obviously has to be an attorney. Hopefully has had a good record. So there are qualifications for that particular office, just like there are for Attorney General. So I think in that sense, money can definitely tip the race, no question. But I think it has less ability in a judicial type context.
This is a local issue. Are you aware of the Cozy Inn versus City of Salina lawsuit?
No, but I do like cozy burgers.
Well, the second part says, would you care to weigh in on it? So he's not aware of it.
I'm not aware of the cause of the lawsuit, or the causes advanced in the lawsuit. But now I'm really curious, and I'm gonna Google that on the way home.
This one says, are there school districts who do not notify parents if their child starts publicly identifying as another gender?
Yes, and I have some good news on that one. So there are 6 school districts originally that were doing this when I became Attorney General. As soon as I found out, we wrote a letter telling those school districts, hey, you're violating federal law. You might be violating the U.S. Constitution. There's a right of parents to control the upbringing of their children. And we're going to take that. We're not going to ignore this. And so 2 school districts, 2 of these large districts, and I can't remember where they were, one was in Wichita, immediately changed their policies and said, okay, we will tell parents. But 4 school districts persisted and said, no, you can pound sand, Mr. Attorney General. And so I then wrote a letter after Trump was elected, wrote a letter to the new Secretary of Education saying these 4 school districts in Kansas are still concealing from parents transitioning by their children and their children's now use of a different gender name. And just 2 weeks ago, the U.S. Department of Justice filed suit against those schools. So, U.S. Department of Justice filed on behalf of the U.S. Department of Education. So yeah, there are some school districts and action is being taken, and they are, if I can remember the list of 4, it's Topeka, 501 Topeka, it's Shawnee Mission, and it's Lawrence, and I can't remember the 5th.
Isn't it Olathe?
I think, yes, it's Olathe. Right.
This question says, I work as a para in an elementary school and was thrilled when they announced that restrooms are based on birth certificate gender. How can reality be established so that liberals quit abusing our youth?
Well, that's a very complicated question. But I like the way it's phrased. How can reality be reestablished? How can we just enforce reality? I mean, there's a lot of interesting aspects of this trans movement, but one of them is that, and it's not just the trans movement, but it's most evident in the trans movement. There's this effort to deny truth, and I think the best example of that is the birth certificate. If you want, in my opinion, if you want to represent yourself as the, dress up like the opposite sex, cut your hair do whatever you want to do to be like the opposite sex, you can. But you can't change the reality that you were born whatever you were born as. And that's why you call it a birth certificate. It's a certification of an historical event, a certification of fact. That's why we call them certifications. And so when they started saying that we want to change birth certificates and say, no, it wasn't a boy that was born on this date in 1990, it was a girl that was born, you're saying that history has changed and that something that was not true is now true. And that's where, at least for me, a line is crossed at multiple stages, but that is the biggest red line. You can't force the rest of Kansas to pretend that something we know to be untrue is true. You can ask us to be polite and can ask us to, not interfere with how you want to portray yourself and how you want to live your life. But you can't make us state something we know to be false. And it's kind of like 1984. If those of you remember the book 1984 by George Orwell, the character in Oceania, I think his first name was Winston. Anybody remember his last name? This is a trivia question. Anyway, Winston, his job was to work in the Ministry of Truth. And what did he do in the Ministry of Truth? He would go back and change historical documents to say something else. That's exactly what changing a birth certificate is. It's Ministry of Truth actions to go back and change your historical document to be something else than what happened in that hospital on that day. So, is there anything we can do to change the desire of some individuals to want to change reality? No, I don't think so. But maybe all this will pass. I don't know. Hopefully.
This question says, are most all of the bad immigrants in Kansas now deported? And I guess that could lead to maybe give an update on our immigration reform status here.
Okay, I don't know what a bad immigrant is. I know there's a legal immigrant and there's an illegal immigrant. They may be good people, but it's bad to break the law. Are they mostly deported? No. There's, by the latest estimates, this estimate is prior to Trump coming in, it was 90,000 illegal aliens in Kansas. That may have gone down a little bit, but it's so hard to estimate because during the Biden administration, the numbers just spiked. And it's definitely going down now because you're seeing deportations and self-deportations where people see that their neighbor just got deported and they're like, I'm going to leave too. But what I can say is if you, by bad you mean criminal, those who have been convicted of crimes, yes, have they all left? No, not yet, but we're getting them out of the country one by one. And is this the last question?
Sure, yes.
Okay, so I'll end on this. So one of the things I did when Trump came into office for a second time, and DHS was back in rational hands that wanted to enforce the law, is I worked with the Trump transition team and said, hey, we need to revitalize the 287G agreement. 287G agreement, also created by Congress in that same law in 1996, says that if a state law enforcement agency or a county sheriff's office wants to train its officers to get some special training to use ICE tools, they can assist ICE and can take on the job of immigration officers as long as they're working under a supervisor from ICE. And so I worked with the transition team, helped get that 287G contract, memorandum of agreement, redrafted to reflect the new realities and get rid of some of the problems of the old one. And then Kansas and Texas were Kansas and Texas were the first two states to have their state law enforcement agencies get 287G powers. My buddy Ken Paxton beat me by just a few days. He didn't even tell me he was going to try to do it. But anyway, I'm getting off on a tangent here. So anyway, the new 287G agreement is very useful for law enforcement agencies because it allows them to get their training remotely. They don't have to fly to the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center in Georgia. They can do it from their sheriff's office wherever they are. And the KBI was the first agency to get it under the new agreement and under the new president. And several counties have already gotten it. Shawnee County's got it. A bunch of other counties have got it. I don't know if Saline County has it or not. But a law was just passed by the legislature to encourage counties to get this. And we have used it at the KBI to deport registered criminals. And by registered, I mean criminals who committed sex offenses or drug offenses or violent offenses of such a magnitude that they are on the registered offender list. That's the one that you can get to online, and you can see if there's anybody in your neighborhood or anybody in your city who is a convicted sex offender or a convicted violent offender. Well, we did something that no one had ever done that I'm aware of in any state. These are lists of people who've already been convicted of crimes. Our 287G officers started working with ICE to bounce this name of these list of registered offenders off the list of known illegal aliens in the country. And lo and behold, we have found a lot of them. And so we held a press conference in November where the first 10 of them we arrested, KBI agents arrested them, and then began the deportation process and handed them over to ICE. And we're talking about some really bad offenders, convicted in Kansas court of sex crimes, of violent crimes, drug crimes. And they're out of the country now. They're out of Kansas. And our KBI is continuing to comb through these lists and arrest and deport people or begin the deportation process. It's a great tool. Thank you. And thank you generally. Thank you for having me here. I appreciate it.
You want to make an announcement? You want to make an announcement?
We want to thank you very much for coming, Kris. This was a very enlightening evening. I want to thank our representatives and our senator for being here tonight also. It's great to have our representative and our senators come out to our meetings. So we want to thank you all for coming, and we'll see you next month.
Thank you.